The air inside the grand sanctum of the planetary capital does not simply exist. It burns with the sickeningly sweet vibration of raw warp energy. To breathe in this throne room is to choke on a chaotic symphony of sensory overload. The physical world weeps beneath the pressure of vibrant, buzzing hues that have no name in the mortal spectrum. Invisible choirs sing impossible geometries into the shattered minds of 1,000 kneeling courtiers. These subjects smile with bleeding eyes, trapped in the euphoric agony of absolute telepathic subjugation. At the center of this golden cage of hubris sits the architect of their living nightmare. He is a rogue psyker of terrible and unchecked power, a man who has usurped a ruling seat through sheer psychic domination. To the Holy Inquisition, he is an abomination meant only for the cleansing pyre or the holds of the black ships. To himself, he is an ascended deity clad in stolen flesh. Let us pause to understand the peril of such a creature. He operates entirely outside the rigid, agonizing sanctions of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, where sanctioned minds are chained by merciless discipline and the soul-binding light of the Master of Mankind. This usurper drinks freely from the poisoned well of the Immaterium. He rules not by right of lawful governance, but through the psychic enslavement of an entire planetary elite. His telepathic grip enforces a flawless illusion of total invulnerability across the capital. He sits upon his desecrated throne, bathed in blinding golden light, utterly convinced that his mind has evolved into a godlike entity. He believes his intellect alone weaves the fabric of reality, bending the material realm to his slightest whim. This monumental arrogance is fortified by the sheer physical might of his stolen citadel. The rogue governor has sealed himself within an impenetrable fortress of forgotten architectural design. Far above the soaring spires, overlapping layers of void shields hum with the concentrated power of chained plasma reactors. These defensive barriers crackle with perpetual static, tearing the very atmosphere into localized storms of ozone and artificial lightning. The shields are a masterpiece of defensive engineering, carefully calibrated to weather the plunging fury of orbital bombardments and the apocalyptic wrath of naval macro-cannon strikes. He believes no force in the galaxy can breach this armored canopy. He revels in the endless adulation of his hollowed-out nobility, completely unaware of the doom that has already been deployed against him. In his twisted perception, the war is already won, and he is the undisputed master of a localized eternity. Yet, beneath the buzzing psychic frequencies and the golden splendor of the inner palace, a different reality begins to assert itself. Far from the telepathic choirs and the sensory madness, the physical borders of his domain rely on a much colder, mundane truth. Down in the shadowed, rain-slicked fortifications of the outer perimeter, elite regiments of mortal soldiers stand their silent watch against the gathering dark. The arrogance of the mind was mirrored by the absolute perfection of the stone. Beyond the telepathic shroud of the master lay the false fortress, a bastion forged from the paranoia of a tyrant. Its corridors were patrolled by a mortal garrison of unparalleled discipline. These were no mere conscripts dragged from the starving underhive. They were an elite cadre of bodyguards raised from birth to serve as the ultimate bulwark against assassination. Clad in interlocking plates of top-tier carapace armor, they moved with a synchronized precision that bordered on the mechanical. Their weapons were master-crafted hellguns, each one tethered to a high-yield power pack capable of reducing an armored target to boiling slag in a single volley. Yet their greatest defense was not their war gear, but their absolute, terrifying incorruptibility. No bribe could tempt their greed, and no threat of torture could break their rigid resolve. They were bound tightly to the governor by a suffocating psychic leash. Every thought of rebellion or fear was extinguished before it could ever form in their minds, leaving only a fanatical, hollow devotion to their psychic master. To complement this unwavering loyalty, the fortress was layered with the absolute pinnacle of mundane security technology. Nothing within the defensive perimeter was ever left to chance. Heavy Auspex scanners bathed every corridor in sweeping waves of invisible radiation, meticulously cataloguing the mass and density of every moving object. Massive adamantium blast doors sealed the inner sanctums, requiring complex genetic locks that sampled blood, breath, and retinal patterns before granting even an inch of passage. Deep within the fortress walls, hypersensitive motion trackers listened silently to the ambient vibrations of the keep. These advanced augurs were so finely tuned that they could easily detect the frantic rhythm of a human heartbeat through 3 meters of dense, reinforced rockcrete. Even a minor vermin scurrying through the deep ventilation shafts would trigger a localized alert, bringing a squad of armed executioners down upon the sector in mere seconds. This was the absolute perfection of the mundane defense. It was a fortress entirely impenetrable to any conventional martial assault the galaxy could muster. Had the Astra Militarum brought their grand siege engines to bear, they would have ground millions of conscripts into bloody paste against the battlements for a standard century without ever breaching the inner keep. Even a highly specialized strike force of the Adeptus Astartes would have found a frontal assault suicidal, their armored drop pods shredded by overlapping fields of automated Icarus Lascanon arrays and Hydra flak batteries before they ever struck the ground. The arrogant governor had accounted for every physical vector of attack known to mankind. He had constructed a cage of supreme security, a massive monument to his own survival that violently defied the very concept of physical infiltration. In the present hour, every guard stood at peak vigilance, their minds synced perfectly to their designated posts, their deadly weapons humming with lethal readiness. The perimeter was completely unbreakable, a flawless testament to mortal engineering and paranoid foresight. For standard centuries, it had kept the endless terrors of a hostile galaxy strictly at bay. But the universe is a dark place of creeping shadows, and there are ancient entities that do not play by the established rules of physics. Deep in the lowest foundational levels, where the Auspex nets overlapped in an impenetrable web of detection, the recycled air grew suddenly unnaturally cold. A singular, impossible anomaly softly registered on the darkest screens of the grand cogitator banks. No klaxons sounded, and no biological heartbeats were detected by the subterranean listening arrays. Something entirely invisible had just walked effortlessly through the outer wall. The intrusion begins not with the thundering retort of macro cannons or the blinding flash of a melter charge. It begins with a creeping horror, a silence so profound that it steals the warmth from the blood. In the outermost corridors of the fortress, the vaunted and impregnable defenses quietly begin to unravel. An unnatural rapid drop in temperature bleeds through the reinforced adamantium bulkheads. Frost crystallizes in jagged fractal patterns upon the curved glass of the outermost Auspex lenses. Yet the cogitator banks remain entirely dormant. The thermal alarms refuse to sing their blaring warnings. There is no flashing rune on the sweeping radar screens to herald the enemy. There is no disruption to the intricately woven deadly last grids. Along the endless perimeter walls, the shadows themselves seem to detach from the Gothic architecture. They deepen into a suffocating shade of black, heavy and oily, pooling in the corners of human vision where light dares not tread. The mortal sentries stationed at these outer cordons feel a subconscious dread welling up in their chests. They pull their heavy flak coats tighter around their shoulders, shivering in the gloom. They eagerly dismiss the sudden biting cold as a mere glitch in the ancient climate control shrines. They tap the glass of their frosted scanners, entirely unaware that the trembling in their limbs is not born of a physical chill. Their very souls are already under a silent, crushing assault. To understand this phenomenon is to peer into the darkest, most forbidden abysses of Imperial lore. This is the terrifying, passive aura of a pariah. It is the chilling manifestation of absolute soullessness, a void that actively hungers for the spark of life. The Culexus Assasin does not merely mask a heat signature or step nimbly between the invisible tripwires of a security grid. By simply drawing breath, the blank drains ambient energy and heat from the physical world. The reality of the galaxy is inextricably bound to the energies of the Empyrean, a dimension of emotion and spiritual resonance. The Auspex arrays and the temperamental machine spirits of the sensory grids are built to perceive matter and energy within the bounds of this living universe. They do not sound an alarm because they are fundamentally incapable of comprehending the presence of an absolute metaphysical void. The senses are failing because physics itself is breaking down around the assassin. They register nothing because to the universe, the pariah is precisely that, nothingness incarnate. As the oily shadow glides deeper into the fortress network, the ambient temperature continues its unnatural plummet. The oppressive darkness spreads like a contagion, swallowing the harsh glow of the lumen globes. What began as a localized environmental anomaly starts to take a dreadful toll upon the fragile flesh and mind. The nervous shivering of the mortal guards rapidly evolves into a deep, agonizing ache within the marrow of their bones. The air grows so utterly desolate that drawing a single breath feels like inhaling powdered glass. The unnatural frost clinging to the perimeter walls was merely the herald of a far more intimate violation. Beyond the creeping shadows, the human toll of the encroaching horror began to manifest within the ranks of the outer guard. These were not trembling conscripts drafted from the lowest dregs of a hive world. They were scarred, unyielding veterans of the governor's personal household guard. These men and women had stood steadfast against the chittering, chitinous tides of the tyrannid swarms without blinking. They had faced the roaring, green-skinned brutality of orc invasions and held the line over mountains of their own dead. Yet now, their legendary discipline began to fray under the suffocating weight of an invisible assault. It started as a subtle throbbing at the base of the skull, a phantom migraine that rapidly escalated into a blinding, agonizing pressure. Every soldier stationed along the barricade felt the same sudden crushing weight building behind their eyes. It was as if the local atmosphere had grown heavy with an ancient and unspoken hatred. A sharp, metallic taste of copper flooded their mouths, completely indistinguishable from the foul flavor of freshly spilled blood. Along with the phantom blood came a rising tide of unprovoked nausea that twisted their battle-hardened stomachs into agonizing knots. Fingers that had expertly stripped lasguns in the pitch blackness of shattered war zones now trembled uncontrollably against their weapon triggers. The guards scanned the freezing gloom with desperate, darting eyes, begging the Emperor for a physical target to emerge. They begged the God Emperor for a shrieking Xenos beast to shoot, a screaming heretic to bayonet, or a tangible monster to face in the brutal certainty of close-quarters slaughter. But the glowing green reticles of their weapon targeters and sweeping Auspex screens remained completely empty. There was no enemy assault line charging through the frozen, unnatural mist. The threat was not an army of flesh and steel, but an ambient dread that seeped right through the plasteel of their armor and directly into their nervous systems. Centuries of rigorous military conditioning completely dissolved into a chaotic chorus of ragged breathing and muffled groans of sheer agony. Mighty veteran sergeants dropped heavily to their knees on the frostbitten rockcrete, clutching their helmets as their vision blurred into static and waking nightmare. They could not fight this merciless foe because they could not see it, could not name it, and could not shoot it. The misery was absolute and infectious, an overwhelming despair that stripped away their hard-earned courage and left only naked, shivering panic. This was no mere biological toxin or chemical weapon deployed by a mundane adversary. As the defending guards began to weep thick tears of blood from their stinging eyes, the true nature of their affliction became terrifyingly clear. The great defensive fortress had indeed been breached, but not by screaming artillery shells or massive siege engines breaking against the outer gates. It was a localized collapse of reality itself, a silent tearing of the fundamental veil that separated the physical universe from the absolute void. The approaching entity radiated a soulless, negative aura that was utterly anathema to the human spark. The physical slaughter of these outer guards was completely unnecessary, for their mortal minds were already snapping under the impossible, crushing weight of a pariah walking among them. Far above this perimeter of weeping and suffering, nestled deep within the shadowed heart of his heavily warded sanctum, the Psyker governor felt the first agonizing echo of that same unraveling reality. Within the shadowed opulence of the inner sanctum, the false god sat enthroned in stolen glory. His mind was a blazing sun, drinking deeply from the infinite wells of the Imperial. Then, without warning, the tether was pulled taut. The absolute arrogance that had fueled his reign shattered in a single breathless heartbeat. Where there had been a boundless reservoir of power, there was suddenly only a suffocating void. He was an aquatic leviathan abruptly dragged onto the sun-baked barren earth, violently thrashing for a substance that was no longer there. The transition was a physical agony beyond mortal comprehension. His invisible lungs were being slowly crushed beneath an unimaginable, unseen pressure. The glorious, vibrant psychic choir that had sung endless praises in the architecture of his mind was abruptly silenced. The symphonic whispers of the warp and the weeping of subservient souls dissolved into a grating, desperate static. A profound and echoing emptiness tore through the chambers of his consciousness. To understand the magnitude of this horror, one must understand the delicate architecture of the psychic mind. To a witch or a sorcerer, the immaterium is not merely an alternate dimension. It is a sweeping, endless ocean of emotional currents and raw, limitless potential. They breathe this etheric tide just as a mortal breathes oxygen. They feel the ebb and flow of joy, rage, and despair as tangible waves washing over their expanded consciousness. The warp is the true reality, and the physical universe is merely a dull shadow. To sever this connection is not to blind a man, but to tear the very atmosphere from his lungs. Now, a great and terrible obstruction was rising in the deep. The approaching Culexus Assasin projected an anti-soul of absolute negation. To the governor's inner eye, this soulless presence was a massive, invisible reef thrusting upward from the abyss. it brutally cut off the eternal tide of the warp. The waters of the great ocean receded with terrifying speed, banished by the encroaching blankness. The Psyker was left completely stranded upon the jagged, unforgiving rocks of real space. He was trapped in a dry, agonizing vacuum where no psychic breath could be drawn. Every instinct screamed for the comforting, chaotic embrace of the warp. Instead, there was only an arid, sterile silence that burned his very essence to cinders. His perceived godhood was evaporating like bloody mist beneath a dying star. The majestic sovereign of a rebellious world was instantly reduced to a gasping, trembling wretch clawing at his own throat. He tasted the foulness of his own sudden, inescapable mortality. The panic was total and absolute. He could feel the edges of his soul fraying as the pariah field ground his psychic presence into useless dust. The spiritual strangulation intensified with every unseen step the assassin took toward the throne room. This violent severance of soul and warp could not be contained within the frail vessel of human flesh alone. The immense pressure of his trapped, aborted psychic energy began to boil over into the physical realm. The absolute horror of his isolation began to bleed into the very stones of his sanctuary. The severing of the witch was merely the beginning of the horror. Now, the very stones of the inner palace begin to comprehend the abomination pressing against their ancient walls. In the grim darkness of our galaxy, there is no true separation between the physical materium and the shifting tides of the immaterium. Every inanimate object, from the grandest cathedral spire to the lowliest paving stone, holds a faint, sympathetic resonance with the warp. It is the underlying spiritual fabric of reality, the unseen metaphysical gravity that binds the material universe together. To introduce a pariah into this delicate tapestry is to unleash an absolute metaphysical anathema upon creation. Reality itself openly revolts against the soulless anomaly. The physical environment of the sanctum actively breaks down, choked by an invisible and merciless contagion. Hundreds of holy votive candles lining the grand hallway do not flicker or blow out from a sudden wind. Their flames simply cease to exist. One moment there is vibrant fire, and the next there is only the smoking ruin of scorched wicks. The golden, holy luminescence of the chamber, blessed by generations of chanting priests, sickens before the unseen blight. The glorious light decays from a radiant divine gold into a bruised, pallid grey. The very atmosphere of the room grows heavy, oppressive, and utterly claustrophobic. It presses down upon the skin like the crushing, freezing waters of a dead ocean. The ancient architecture groans in a silent, mounting agony. Massive gilded mirrors that have reflected the majesty of the Imperium for millennia surrender to the localized fraying of physics. They crack sequentially down the length of the endless corridor. Each sudden fracture is a jagged spiderweb of ruined glass, shattering in perfect, unnatural rhythm as the anomaly draws nearer. The sanctum is no longer a place of sacred refuge. It has become a hostile, decaying tomb, abruptly stripped of all sustaining grace. Even the microscopic friction of dust motes dancing in the dead light seems to falter and stall. The lingering warp taint woven into the palace architecture is violently purged under the tremendous weight of an entity that embodies absolute negation. Matter requires the subtle anchor of the warp to maintain its ordained shape in a cosmos ruled by emotion and belief. Bereft of that metaphysical anchor, the marble walls weep a fine alkaline dust. The ornate mosaic floors shudder weakly, as if the foundations of the palace wish to recoil from the abomination. The physical universe is violently rejecting the blank, attempting to expel a paradox that murders the fundamental laws of existence. Yet, the pariah continues its methodical, relentless advance, entirely uncaring of the monumental distress it inflicts upon the surrounding world. The fraying edges of reality simply retreat before its measured footsteps, leaving nothing but an agonizing, desolate void in its wake. The breathable air thins into a harsh metallic chill, and the groaning stone finally surrenders to the inevitable decay. Every dying echo within the Grand Palace is swallowed whole, dragged down into the suffocating depths of an approaching, weaponized silence. As the final fractured shards of inanimate material settle upon the polished floor, the universe simply stops. The ceaseless, grinding symphony of the Hive City is instantly eradicated. This is not the mere absence of ambient noise. This is a weaponized silence. It is a localized absolute zero of sound, a necrotic void that swallows every vibration and every desperate breath. For an attuned psychic mind, the material realm is never truly quiet. It is a roaring, turbulent ocean of life and emotion. A high-born psyker hears the ambient hum of a billion souls, perceiving the distant emotional echoes of joy, terror, and despair radiating from the unwashed masses below. To them, the immaterium provides an eternal choir of whispered secrets, an endless potential. Now that psychic background radiation is violently and completely extinguished. The sudden erasure of the warp does not feel like peace. It feels like the suffocating gravity of a dying star. The silence descends upon the room as a heavy, crushing physical weight. It bears down upon the helpless governor with the unimaginable atmospheric pressure of a deep-sea trench. The sheer density of this auditory hallucination pushes inward against the fragile bones of his skull. Frail capillaries burst beneath the unnatural strain. Thick, dark blood begins to stream from the psychic governor's ears, weeping steadily down his ornate velvet collars. He drops to his knees and clutches his head in absolute agony. He screams for his guards, but the void consumes the sound before it can even reverberate against his own teeth. For a man accustomed to wearing the thoughts of thousands like a grand imperial tapestry, this sudden isolation is a terrifying form of sensory deprivation. He is plunged into the lightless, soundless dungeon of his own mortal mind. The golden connection to the Empyrean, the very wellspring of his stolen authority and power, has been brutally severed. He is entirely alone in his own head, trapped within a prison of flesh and bone. Madness and panic set in, sharp and primal. He blindly reaches out with his mind, thrashing against the invisible walls of this cage, desperate to feel even a singular flicker of the warp. He finds nothing but a cold, suffocating emptiness. The warp itself is recoiling in absolute terror from this place. To silence the immaterium so completely requires an abomination against the natural order of the cosmos. It takes a biological nightmare that defies the sacred design of life. The universe naturally abhors a vacuum, yet this encroaching shadow is entirely hollow, devoid of any spiritual signature. The treasonous governor weeps tears of blood upon the stone, utterly broken by the mere proximity of his unseen executioner. He is experiencing the absolute terror of the soulless, a phenomenon that repulses both man and demon alike. To understand the true nature of this crushing, deafening dread, we must look backward into the darkest, most strictly forbidden vaults of the Imperial Inquisition. We must examine the dark genesis of the genetic anomaly that casts such a terrifying anti-psychic shadow. To understand the nature of this bleeding silence is to understand the darkest anomaly of human evolution. The Inquisition measures the psychic potential of mankind through the assignment scale. At the highest echelons burn the Alpha Plus mutants, minds capable of shattering worlds and tearing open the fabric of reality. But the scale does not merely measure the presence of the warp, it measures its absolute absence. At the very bottom of this hierarchy lies the Omega Minus classification. This is the realm of the pariah. They are the untouchables, the blanks, the living contradictions to the grand design of life. In a universe where the soul is the fundamental currency of existence, the pariah is entirely bankrupt. Every living creature casts a shadow into the Empyrean, a flicker of spiritual light that proves they exist. The Omega Minus casts nothing. They are a profound biological anomaly, a walking void where a soul should be. This is not merely a passive emptiness. It is a hungry, abrasive negation of the immaterium. To possess the pariah gene is to endure a waking nightmare. From the moment they draw their first breath, they project an aura of innate, repulsive wrongness. Even their own mothers feel an instinctive, violent revulsion toward them. They are cast out, abandoned in the underhives, or murdered in their cribs by parents who cannot explain the creeping dread their offspring inspires. They are universally despised, radiating a subliminal static that triggers the deepest primal terrors in normal humanity. Yet the Imperium wastes nothing, not even the damned. The sinister masters of the Culexus Temple actively hunt for these cursed outcasts. The dread black ships of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica and the silent, unmarked frigates of the Ordo Hereticus scour the galaxy, plucking these forsaken pariahs from the gutters and the pyres before the mob can claim them. Within the hidden anti-psychic vaults of their fortress, the Temple does not merely train them as conventional soldiers. The Culexus Masters refine their absolute nothingness. They take the tragic, isolated existence of the blank and distill it into the ultimate weapon against the witch. Cybernetic dampeners and esoteric helm systems are bolted into their skulls, designed to hold back the suffocating tide of their negative aura until the precise moment of execution. The Culexus Assassin is not a warrior of the martial elite. They are a weaponized black hole of negative existence. They are tragedy clad in sin skin, an entity of pure anti-life forced into the shape of a humanoid executioner. When they are unleashed upon a target, they do not fight with martial pride or righteous fury. They simply walk forward, radiating the icy vacuum of their own soulless reality. It is this very vacuum that now spills through the darkened corridors of the compound. The mortal sentries standing between the assassin and the heretic psyker do not know of the Omega Minus curse. They only know that the air has suddenly turned to ash in their lungs. They only know that their minds are unraveling, screaming against the approach of a shadow that should not exist. To witness the pariah gene in proximity is to watch the sudden, inescapable unraveling of the human condition. We return our gaze to the inner sanctum, to the elite veterans of the personal guard. These are men and women forged in the bloody crucibles of the galaxy. They have held the line against chittering Xeno swarms and stared unblinking into the eyes of malefic warlords. They know the face of death and have mocked it 1,000 times before. Yet now, as the untouchable presence washes over the chamber, their legendary discipline crumbles into worthless ash. Do not mistake this rapid, devastating collapse for ordinary cowardice. Cowardice is merely a failure of the will, a conscious surrender to mortal fear. What seizes the minds of these bodyguards is something far more ancient, primitive, and absolute. It is an evolutionary mandate forced upon them by the very architecture of their humanity. Consider the concept of the soul as a living, breathing organ within the metaphysical body. When a deadly contagion breaches human flesh, the biological immune system reacts with violent, feverish hostility to purge the lethal intruder. The human spirit possesses its own mirror to this vital defense mechanism. It is the soul's immune response. As the blank draws near, the suffocating null aura floods over the defenders like a deluge of freezing rot. The soul detects this absolute void, this agonizing wrongness tearing at the fabric of reality, and it violently revolts. The spirit rejects the proximity of a creature that fundamentally should not exist in the material universe. This profound spiritual revulsion cascades instantly into the physical nervous system of every mortal present. Dread ceases to be a simple emotion and transforms into a potent chemical poison. It floods their synapses, scouring away all higher cognitive function and overriding decades of rigorous hypno-indoctrination. The very concept of courage is systematically eroded. It is stripped away by an overwhelming, deafening biological imperative to simply survive the impossible. Rational thought is entirely eclipsed by the screaming, wordless alarm of the soul reacting to a cosmic abomination. The veteran guards drop their aim as ornate Las rifles become impossibly heavy in their trembling, sweating hands. Rigid military cohesion disintegrates into a chaotic, writhing mass of hyperventilating terror. They are no longer proud soldiers standing in defiance to protect a high lord. They are suddenly reduced to frightened animals trapped in a lightless cage with an apex predator of the spirit. The aura of the pariah suffocates the tiny spark of the warp that dwells within every living human being. It projects a localized entropy that makes the recycled air feel thick, tasting bitterly of copper and old blood. As the chemical panic reaches its zenith, the human mind desperately seeks any avenue of escape from the creeping, silent oblivion. The metaphysical pressure inside their skulls builds to an unbearable crescendo, driving these unbroken heroes past the absolute brink of sanity. The agonizing weight of the blankness demands an immediate, visceral release from the sheer horror of their own withering existence. We spoke of the spiritual revulsion, the innate recoil of the human soul when confronted with the abyss. Now you shall bear witness to its physical manifestation in terrifying, devastating detail. The grand fortress of the planetary governor was sealed tight against all forms of conventional warfare. Its multi-layered void shields crackled with enough arcane energy to absorb a localized orbital bombardment. Yet these sacred marvels of the Adeptus Mechanicus were utterly useless against the absolute void that now walked through their hallowed halls. There was no screaming artillery raining down upon the battlements. There was no roaring wave of heretics charging their defensive barricades. Instead, an invisible, suffocating wave of metaphysical wrongness bled effortlessly through the reinforced plasteel. It was an atmospheric terror that bypassed thick ceramite armor and struck directly at the fragile, unprotected core of human sanity. The governor had surrounded himself with the absolute zenith of his planetary defense forces. These were elite veterans, tempest-hardened shock troops whose regimental banners were heavy with battle honors. Within moments, their legendary discipline evaporated into the cold air. Flawless interlocking firing lines dissolved as soldiers began to stagger, clutching desperately at their helmets as if trying to physically hold their minds together. The tactical Vox channels, previously crisp with rigid military cipher and precise Auspex readings, devolved into a pathetic chorus of absolute despair. Where there should have been disciplined target designations, there was only the wet, ragged sound of frantic hyperventilation. Grown men, forged in the relentless crucible of the Emperor's wars, wept openly into their microbeads. Their frenzied, incoherent prayers to the God Emperor jammed every frequency, creating a continuous babble of pleading terror that offered absolutely no salvation from the encroaching doom. Observe the commander of the watch, a heavily decorated veteran standing guard at the inner sanctum doors. His carapace plating is adorned with campaign ribbons, and thick parchment purity seals trail from his pauldrons. He has stared into the eyes of monstrous Xenos and unholy traitors without ever taking a single step backward. Yet now his hands tremble so violently that his heavy hellgun simply slips from his grasp, clattering uselessly against the pristine deck plating. He sinks heavily to his knees, his eyes wide with an unseen, localized horror before collapsing entirely. This grizzled soldier, a paragon of Imperial might, curls deeply into a tight fetal position upon the cold iron floor. He sobs uncontrollably, whimpering through clenched teeth, his shattered mind trying desperately to hide from the agonizing, soulless presence drawing near. He is completely neutralized, his lifelong martial prowess unraveling into nothingness without a single physical blow being struck by the silent assassin. The disciplined, rigid hierarchy of the governor's personal army simply ceased to exist. Officers clawed at their own faces, utterly unable to issue commands through their violently chattering teeth. The spiritual immune response had completely short-circuited their rational thought, leaving nothing but raw, primitive panic in its devastating wake. It was an annihilation of military cohesion so absolute that it defied all strategic logic. The entire elite unit was effectively destroyed by the sheer weight of an approaching shadow. But this paralyzing dread was merely the precipice of their agonizing suffering. The suffocating pressure within the compound was rapidly approaching a boiling point, preparing to tip the entire garrison over the edge into irreversible madness and violent self-destruction. The weeping of the elite guard did not last, for sorrow is an emotion of the soul, and their souls were being systematically suffocated. Where tears failed to wash away the creeping cold, pure and unadulterated lunacy took hold. To exist within the absolute negation of the Culexus pariah is to endure a violation so profound that the human mind simply shatters to escape it. The untouchable aura of the assassin is anathema to the warp, a localized black hole in the spiritual fabric of the universe that draws the life force out of everything it nears. There was no physical enemy the guards could see, no tangible target they could engage, only an encroaching void that gnawed at the metaphysical root of their being. Driven beyond the fragile limits of mortal endurance, the defenders of the inner sanctum turned upon themselves. One veteran, a man who had stood unbroken against the charging masses of Xenos hordes, dropped his weapon and began to frantically claw at his own face. He dug his armored gauntlets deep into his eye sockets, desperate to scrape away a suffocating shadow that he believed was blinding him. It was not a shadow of the material realm, but the absolute eclipse of his own spirit. He screamed in raw, bloody triumph as he tore away his own vision, seeking a darkness less agonizing than the blank aura of the approaching killer. His grotesque self-mutilation was the catalyst for a total, systemic collapse of reason. Around him, discipline evaporated into a savage tempest of friendly fire. Men and women of the elite household guard raised their hell guns and fired wildly into the suffocating gloom of the corridor. They unleashed blinding volleys of searing energy into the shadows, frantic to kill the unseen source of their terror. Instead, they butchered their own comrades. High-yield lass beams sheared through carapace armor and human tissue, filling the confined space with the stench of vaporized blood and roasting meat. To the fractured minds of the soldiers, the faces of their lifelong friends contorted into the grinning skull visage of the approaching nightmare. They fought each other with the feral intensity of cornered beasts, driven by the singular and overwhelming desire to cease existing. Death was no longer a dread fate, but a desperately sought salvation from the agonizing pressure of the soulless abomination drawing near. They eagerly embraced the lethal crossfire, throwing themselves into the paths of scorching beams just to force their hearts to stop beating. In a matter of minutes, the final, impenetrable layer of defense surrounding the planetary governor had consumed itself in a frenzied orgy of suicidal violence. The guards had done the bloody work of the executioner for him, leaving behind nothing but a charnel house of mangled corpses and sizzling weaponry. The grotesque symphony of their self-destruction reverberated down the vaulted halls, a cacophony of shrieks and weapons fire that slowly died away into a heavy, suffocating silence. Those sickening echoes bled through the heavy adamantium blast doors of the inner sanctum. Inside his sealed and fortified retreat, the governor listened as the last of his protectors violently expired, leaving only the slow, methodical footsteps of the nightmare arriving at his door. Deep within the armored heart of his citadel, the rogue telepath watched his empire die through the cold lenses of internal auger feeds. He witnessed the utter annihilation of his invincible Praetorians. What bitter, exquisite irony it was. For decades, this false lord had ruled through the absolute subjugation of the human mind. He had bent planetary governors to his will, crushed rebellions with a single psychic command, and built an impenetrable fortress upon the foundation of dominated souls. He considered himself a god incarnate, a transcendent being evolved far beyond the crude limitations of mortal flesh and base steel. Now, the architect of 1,000 mental conquests was reduced to a trembling, impotent wretch. He clawed frantically at the edges of the warp, desperately seeking a mind to dominate, a soul to crush, or even a stray psychic echo to weaponize. He found nothing except a suffocating, bottomless void. The sheer magnitude of the blankness pressing against his sanctum shattered his vast intellect. He was an undisputed master of the immaterium, yet he was being completely unmade by a creeping dread that possessed no soul at all. Through the grainy picked captures, he watched the final bloody convulsions of his heavily augmented guard. Men who had sworn eternal loyalty and survived a dozen grueling crusades ripped out their own eyes and tore at their throats, driven to absolute suicidal madness by the approaching anti-light. Then, the horrific carnage abruptly ceased. The cacophony of dying screams did not fade into the distance, nor did it gradually taper off into whimpers of defeat. It was severed completely. Total, absolute silence slammed into the throne room like a physical shockwave of concussive force. The psychic static that had always buzzed in the back of the governor's mind, the constant murmurs of the billions of souls he ruled across the sector, was violently extinguished. He was suddenly deafened by the sheer absence of the Empyrean. The localized void had finally breached the inner threshold. The atmospheric recyclers ground to a halt as the air within the grand sanctum rapidly grew freezing cold. Frost crept rapidly across the gilded statues of his false idols, and the very breath of the usurper crystallized in the sudden, unnatural winter. He backed away from the grand entrance, his hands trembling violently as he gathered the last dregs of his telekinetic fury. He prepared himself for a violent, explosive breach. He expected the colossal adamantium blast doors to buckle, warp, and explode inward under the kinetic force of some terrible siege weapon. Instead, the heavy locking mechanism simply disengaged without a single sound. The rudimentary machine spirits of the barricade were silenced by archaeotech data spikes, their cogitator shrines forcibly overridden by the assassin's esoteric infiltration rites. With a horrific, soundless grace, the massive doors slid slowly apart. Beyond the threshold lay only an abyss of suffocating shadows and the promise of utter oblivion. The psychic king stared into the chilling darkness, his sovereign power entirely useless against the encroaching, soulless void. The temperature plummeted even further, freezing the tears of blood that now leaked continuously from his straining eyes. Out of that terrible, absolute gloom, a single shadow began to detach itself from the surrounding blackness. From the freezing darkness of the shattered vault, a localized eclipse steps out into the trembling light. The entity that emerges from the creeping hoarfrost is no mere killer, no graceful martial artist honed in the mundane disciplines of mortal combat. It is a walking nightmare ripped from the most forbidden sealed archives of the Officio Assassinorum. It moves with a halting, unnatural cadence that offends the very laws of reality, a phantom forged of absolute negation. The creature is clad in a specialized sin-skin suit that utterly defies illumination. This unnatural material does not simply reject the ambient glow of the flickering lumen strips, it actively and violently drinks it. Where the assassin stands, a weeping saw is torn into the visual spectrum, a terrifying silhouette of pure, devouring emptiness. Every step it takes consumes the light, casting the surrounding chamber into a suffocating, unnatural gloom. Yet the ultimate paralyzing horror of the Culexus lies in the crown it bears upon its shoulders. Dominating the assassin's form is the animus speculum, a massive and grotesque helm sculpted to resemble a terrifying, elongated human skull. It is a macabre altar of synthetic bone and esoteric, forbidden machinery that entirely distorts the proportions of the monster wearing it. At the center of this ghastly visage rests a single cyclopean eye. It is a dead, glassy lens of obsidian and blackened brass, radiating an aura of total spiritual annihilation. To the uninitiated, this helm might seem a mere instrument of psychological warfare, a mask designed to evoke primal terror. In truth, it is a desperate, highly unstable arcane containment device. Within the skull of the Culexus beats a localized vortex of the anti-warp, a terrifying blankness that the animus speculum barely holds in check. Without this massive, heavy casing of psychically nullifying ward tech, the raw, unfettered torrent of the assassin's negative energy would instantly and violently obliterate the minds of anything within a league. The helm strains to restrain the soulless hurricane of the pariah gene, metering out the lethal anti-radiation in agonizing, focused beams of pure malice. The immense psychic weight of this containment presses upon the chamber, turning the very air to ash and freezing the blood in the corrupted governor's veins. As the monstrous entity finally pauses, the dead cyclopean eye locks onto its prey. To meet that dark gaze is not to look upon a living being, but to peer over the jagged, crumbling edge of a bottomless abyss. The governor stares into that singular, unblinking lens, and feels the sudden, sickening realization of his own absolute insignificance before the uncaring universe. The void stares back into him, promising not just physical death, but the total and permanent unmaking of his immortal soul. The aura of inescapable dread tightens like a noose of black iron around the rebellious ruler. All his arrogant delusions of grandeur, all the dark protective blessings of his warp-spawned patrons are ruthlessly stripped away in the presence of this living anti-truth. Trapped between the devouring shadow of the Culexus and the cold, unyielding walls of his ruined sanctum, the heretic's panic reaches a terrifying fever pitch. The overwhelming, mind-shattering terror does not break his spirit entirely, but instead kindles the frantic, violent spark of absolute desperation. He gathers the last desperate dregs of his stolen power, preparing to hurl his unholy might against an enemy that simply should not exist. To stand within the immediate presence of an Omega- pariah is to be submerged in an ocean of absolute, suffocating nothingness. The air itself grows heavy and foul, devoid of the spiritual resonance that binds the material universe together. For a psyker, this proximity is not merely uncomfortable, but a profound and tearing violation of the soul. The planetary governor, once a man of arrogant and effortless power, now found himself drowning in a metaphysical vacuum. The warp, an ever-present hum at the edge of his consciousness, had been brutally severed. In its place was a deafening, terrifying silence that threatened to unravel his sanity. Driven by the primal, desperate instinct of a cornered beast, the governor sought to reach out to the immaterium. Under normal circumstances, summoning a tempest of warp fire required nothing more than a casual flick of his wrist and a fleeting thought. He had roasted dissidents and rivals to ash with less effort than it took to draw breath. Now, the simple act of kindling a single psychic spark demanded an exertion so vast it defied mortal comprehension. It was the excruciating equivalent of a man attempting to heave a colossal granite boulder using only shattered, splintered arms. The dampening field of the Culexus Assasin pressed down upon him like the crushing depths of an oceanic trench. Every mental pathway he tried to force open was instantly met with a suffocating resistance that tore at the very fabric of his mind. The sheer physical toll of this unnatural defiance manifested in horrific fashion. Deep crimson blood began to flow freely from the governor's nostrils, staining his opulent velvet robes. Capillaries burst within his eyes, turning his vision into a haze of red agony as thick tears of blood spilled down his trembling cheeks. His heart hammered furiously against his ribs, pushing his mortal shell to the absolute brink of a catastrophic aneurysm. He was attempting to draw water from a poisoned, dried-up well, forcing his brain to bridge a gap that the pariah aura had violently annihilated. The pain was a living, breathing entity, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness and demanding his surrender. Yet the terror of the skull-faced executioner standing before him pushed the psyker beyond the limits of human endurance. Through a sheer, unadulterated act of desperate willpower, the governor battered his mind against the impenetrable wall of the blank. He channeled his terror into a singular, agonizing focal point, ignoring the copper taste of blood filling his mouth and the lethal pressure building behind his eyes. The dampening field fought him for every millimeter of psychic reach, screaming a silent song of oblivion into his soul. He refused to die as a helpless victim in the dark. With a final gargantuan exertion that threatened to rip his mind asunder, he forced a jagged tear into the suffocating void. A single virulent spark of warp fire finally ignited within the absolute blackness of the dampening field. His shattered psyche grasped that flickering ember of the Immaterium, preparing to hurl the raw, screaming energy of the warp into the face of his inevitable doom. The shriek of the Immaterium tore through the opulent chamber. The traitor governor unleashed the totality of his stolen might in a blinding torrent of warp fire. Roaring cascades of violent purple and searing cerulean light flooded the throne room. The sheer thermal agony of the blast was enough to reduce the heavy plasteel hull of a Lehman Russ battle tank to bubbling slag. Ancient marble pillars cracked and shattered under the warp-borne heat. Priceless silken tapestries ignited and turned to ash in a fraction of a heartbeat. The atmosphere itself boiled, tainted by the sickly sweet stench of raw, chaotic mutation. For one fleeting second, a desperate ember of hope ignited within the treacherous soul of the governor. He believed, in his profound hubris, that this apocalyptic display of psychic dominance would ensure his survival. He poured every ounce of his corrupted essence into the inferno, screaming as he sought to incinerate the nightmare that had come for him. The torrent struck with the force of a falling star. Yet the Culexus Assassin did not leap. The phantom did not dive into the shadows or attempt to outrun the blast. The executioner deployed no crackling energy shield to deflect the ruinous tide. Instead, the pariah remained an avatar of absolute, terrifying stillness. Step by silent step, the blank walked directly into the blinding heart of the maelstrom. This was the slow, inexorable march of a predator that defied the fundamental laws of reality. The raging tempest of Immaterium energy battered against the grim Avenger, but it found no purchase. There was no explosive collision of conflicting magics. There was no cinematic clash of opposing martial forces. The true horror of the Culexus lies not in overwhelming strength, but in absolute, unfathomable negation. As the screaming warp fire made contact with the executioner, it simply ceased to be. The brilliant arcs of psychic flame withered and died upon impact, swallowed by a terrifying void. The roaring blast wrapped around the pitch-black sin skin of the assassin without leaving a single singe mark. It was as if the supernatural fire was striking the surface of a silent black hole. The sorcery was drawn into a fathomless abyss where the warp itself was rendered utterly impotent. The air within the ruined chamber grew instantly, unnaturally cold as the psychic energy was cleanly erased from the physical universe. The governor watched his salvation evaporate into absolute nothingness. His manic shriek of triumph morphed into a gurgle of paralyzing, cold dread. He realized the inferno that was meant to consume his enemy was instead being consumed itself. Every spark of his unholy fire, every ounce of his desperate soul was being greedily devoured by the monstrous cyclopean eye mounted upon the dark skull helm of his killer. This unnatural aperture drank the warp flame with a predatory mechanical hunger, preparing to return the psychic gift in a catastrophic reflection. The raging tempest of warp fire crashes against the unyielding silhouette of the Culexus Assassin. Yet the apocalyptic flames do not consume the executioner. To comprehend the horror now unfolding within the ruined sanctum is to understand the terrifying mechanism of the animus speculum. This macabre skull helm is a marvel of lost epochs and tightly restricted archaeotech. It is fundamentally misunderstood by the doomed souls who face it. The grim visage is not merely a shield forged to deflect the unnatural energies of the Immaterium, it is a siphon. When the raw psychic fury of the corrupted governor meets the abyssal aura of the pariah, it reacts in a spectacular display of denied reality. The interaction is exactly like a single drop of water striking a red-hot iron plate. The vibrant, shrieking warp fire hisses violently as it touches the dead space surrounding the assassin. It vaporizes instantly against the unnatural void of the untouchable soul. But the chaotic energy is not simply negated and scattered to the winds. It is inhaled. Every jagged arc of corrupting lightning and every suffocating wave of soul-burning fire is sucked directly into the single unblinking eye of the skull helm. Deep within the heavily shielded casing of the animus speculum, a captive null matrix spins in silent eternal hunger. This esoteric mechanical heart captures the incoming witchfire with ruthless efficiency. The dark machinery inverts the psychic resonance and strips away the chaotic taint to leave only weaponized oblivion. The loud and vibrant warp fire is swallowed completely by the absolute dark. The deafening, roaring inferno that promised absolute salvation to the heretic is suddenly and totally gone. The attack is over. A cold and suffocating silence reclaims the shattered throne room. In this heavy quiet, the governor realizes the true magnitude of his fatal error. Mounting absolute dread paralyzes his trembling limbs as the icy truth settles into his panicked mind. His most devastating and desperate attack did not just fail to harm the faceless nightmare standing before him. He has fed the very weapon that is about to end his miserable life. The arcane capacitors of the animus speculum hum with stolen might. The immense psychic energy he poured into his desperate strike has been digested and twisted into a concentrated beam of anti-psychic annihilation. The Culexus Assasin stands perfectly motionless within the rapidly dissipating smoke. The single cyclopean eye of the grim helmet begins to glow with a sickly negative light. The dreadful weapon is now fully charged by the target's own arrogant power. The governor's final fragile hope shatters like brittle glass beneath a heavy ceramite boot. He is no longer a dark god among terrified men. He is nothing more than a helpless sacrifice waiting upon the altar of his own arrogant making. The infinite void of the pariah stares back at him through the glowing lens of the dead helm. The skull slowly aligns with the center of the heretic's chest. The inescapable execution is prepared. The stolen warp craft is digested and weaponized within the dark heart of the assassin. The intricate mechanisms of the animus speculum unlock with terrifying finality. The singular eye of the pariah opens fully to deliver the ultimate judgment. What pours forth from the ancient temple relic is not a beam of coherent light. It is not a projectile of physical matter driven by explosive ignition. It is an eruption of concentrated anti-psychic force. It is the absolute distillation of unreality, where a conventional weapon would scorch the air with blinding brilliance and roaring heat. The dread relic of the Culexus temple delivers nothing but absolute and suffocating silence. The blast is a torrent of pitch-black nothingness. It does not strike with the instantaneous speed of a laser. Instead, it creeps across the distance, separating the executioner and the condemned. The negative energy moves with the sluggish and heavy inevitability of falling tar. It stretches through the air like a localized tear in the fabric of existence, dragging the very concept of reality down into its abyssal depths. The radiant and golden illumination of the governor and his opulent throne room is instantly corrupted. Light itself is sucked directly into the creeping pillar of darkness. The vibrant hues of the surrounding tapestries and grand windows drain away into lifeless husks. The ambient temperature plummets as the air around the blast instantly freezes into an unnatural frost. The sheer weight of this anti-reality presses against the material world, warping the physical dimensions of the grand chamber without ever making a single sound. When the pitch-black beam finally connects with the defiant governor, there is no grand explosion. There is no concussive force. He is not violently thrown backward by a kinetic shockwave. His lavish silken robes are not shredded by shrapnel. His flesh is not ignited by thermal fury. Instead, the mortal shell of the traitor is simply frozen in place as the void pierces his chest. The physical manifestation of this anti-life anchors the psyker exactly where he stands. The heavy and tarry beam sinks deep into his torso, entirely bypassing his fragile meat and bone. The unreality seeks a far more vital target within him. It hungers only for his soul. The surrounding silence becomes absolute as the immense psychic presence of the governor is instantly neutralized. The triumphant golden light of his personal power is completely devoured. Only the grim and elongated shadow of the assassin remains cast across the frozen throne room. The governor stands perfectly still, locked entirely inside the suffocating grip of the void. The physical world falls away from him as the pure essence of the blank surges through his nervous system. His mortal body is trapped in the stasis of a ruined reality. He can neither scream nor draw a dying breath as the black beam anchors him to the final agonizing moment of his physical existence. The materium fades away from his failing senses, dragging his isolated consciousness inward into the dark. To die as a psyker is to be acutely aware of the precipice. Usually, when the mortal shell fails, a psychic soul erupts into the immaterium like a blinding distress flare in the dark. In the churning ocean of the warp, it faces a terrible, predictable fate. It might be violently torn apart by the ravenous denizens of the Imperial. It might dissolve into the raw, screaming tides of chaotic energy. If the psyker is truly blessed, it might find brief shelter in the blinding radiance of the God Emperor. But the beam unleashed by the Culexus Assasin offers none of these things. It delivers the rarest and most terrifying doom in a cruel galaxy. It delivers true death. The rogue governor feels the strike connect, but the agony is not merely of the flesh. It is a profound, metaphysical severing. He is a creature deeply attuned to the psychic song of the universe, yet suddenly that song is violently silenced. The absolute anti-light of the pariah floods his spiritual pathways. It acts as a conceptual acid, eating away the very foundations of his immortal being. He braces for the tearing claws of demons or the agonizing pull of the warp. Instead, he finds an infinite suffocating vacuum. In the span of a single microsecond, an eternity of horror unfolds within his fading mind. He realizes with crystalline clarity that he is not crossing over to an afterlife. He is not descending into the hellish depths of the immaterium to suffer for his treason. He is simply ceasing to be. His cherished memories, his towering ambitions, his sins, and his darkest secrets are unraveling thread by invisible thread. It is an ultimate cosmic claustrophobia. The governor feels his essence shrinking, compressed by the crushing weight of absolute, irreversible nothingness. There is no echo of his existence left to resonate in the immaterium. He tries to scream into the warp, to send one final psychic death rattle out into the void. Nothing happens. The anti-psychic oblivion swallows his desperation before it can even form. His spiritual anchor to the universe is violently ripped loose and incinerated. To be damned is a terrible fate, but to be erased entirely is a horror beyond mortal comprehension. He is stripped of his past, his present, and his eternal future. The governor experiences the total agonizing destruction of his consciousness. Every triumphant memory and every spark of defiance is systematically unwritten. His identity is deleted from the grand tapestry of creation as if he had never drawn breath. The agonizing erasure completes its dreadful work in absolute spiritual silence. Where once a blazing psychic presence defied the will of terror, there is now only an unnatural, hollow void. The terror of non-existence finally gives way to the cold reality of the material universe. Without the soul to anchor it, the mortal vessel shatters. The physical remnants of his body are left to suffer the immediate, violent physics of the assassin's strike. The blinding negative light ceases, and the unnatural crushing silence of the pariah recedes into the shadows. The animus speculum powers down, its terrifying eye closing as the fabric of the materium shudders back into a fragile equilibrium. Upon the shimmering golden throne sits the sovereign of this defiant world. Yet he is a king no longer. He is merely a monument to the ultimate inescapable sanction of the Officio Assassinorum. To look upon the fallen governor is to confront a profound and terrifying wrongness. There are no searing burn marks upon his regal finery. There is no spilled blood staining the polished adamantium of his majestic dais. No physical trauma mars the surface of his aristocratic flesh. The bolt, the blade, and the flame always leave undeniable visceral signatures of their ruin. The Culexus leaves nothing but an absolute absence. The biological shell is left a ruined husk. While his torso remains untouched by conventional munitions, his skull is fractured from the inside out, thick black blood weeping from ruptured sinuses where his brain was catastrophically liquefied. Yet the governor is dead. He has not perished from the systemic failure of his mortal vessel, but from the sudden catastrophic theft of his vital spark. The immortal soul that burned so brightly with profane witchfire, the essence that reached arrogantly into the howling Empyrean, has been annihilated. It was not merely severed or evicted from the flesh, it was unmade. It was erased completely and permanently from the grand tapestry of existence. He sits slumped upon his throne in an undignified heap, reduced to a morbid pile of expensive silks and rapidly cooling meat. His eyes are locked wide open, staring blankly out into the cavernous audience chamber. Before the execution, those eyes swam with the chaotic multicolored luminescence of the warp. Now they are entirely dull, they are opaque, milky, and fundamentally empty. They are shattered windows to a house that has been utterly abandoned, reflecting a universe that no longer recognizes the occupant. The sheer, visceral unnaturalness of his corpse defies the fundamental laws of life and death. It is a sickening paradox made flesh, a horror that the human mind inherently rejects. Humanity instinctively understands death through physical decay, through brutal destruction, through the violent and bloody cessation of motion. But this pristine corpse represents something infinitely worse. It is a meat puppet whose invisible spiritual strings have been abruptly cut by the cold scissors of reality. The Culexus Assassin has performed the darkest alchemy, transmuting a psychic god-king into worthless, inanimate matter in the span of a single heartbeat. The great Psyker, a being who believed himself capable of bending minds and breaking Imperial armies, is now less than ash. Ash at least holds the charred memory of the fire that consumed it. The hollow husk upon the throne holds nothing at all. The blank entity steps backward, melting seamlessly into the encroaching gloom of the Great Hall. The mission is concluded, and the terrifying, soul-draining aura of the pariah departs with its grim harbinger. Left behind is only the mundane quiet of the grave, settling heavily over the desecrated majesty of the high spire. There is no triumphant declaration to mark the end of this dark deed. The assassin of the Culexus temple does not speak, does not gloat, and leaves no mocking calling card to taunt the defeated. Such mortal vanities are the domain of living creatures burdened by emotion and ego. The pariah is merely an instrument of the absolute negation of the emperor, a weapon that has served its singular grim purpose. Without a sound, the faceless phantom turns away from the hollowed husk of the false god. The executioner simply steps backward into the freezing dark from which they came, dissolving into the very shadows that bleed between the stars. They are a nightmare returning to the abyss, leaving behind a reality fundamentally fractured by their passing. High above the suffocating atmosphere of the planetary capital, the true scale of the horror finally reveals itself. To the uninitiated eye, looking down from orbit, the majestic stronghold appears entirely untouched. Its void shields still hum with latent energy. Its adamantium battlements stand proud and unbroken, defiant against the conventional ravages of war. Yet this impenetrable fortress is nothing more than a magnificent, silent tomb. The towering outer walls were never breached, but the precious souls within were utterly annihilated. Inside those pristine fortifications, the winding corridors are slick with the blood of zealots who tore out their own eyes in the suffocating presence of the ultimate void. The grand vaulted halls now echo only with the weeping of gibbering madmen. These broken survivors wander aimlessly through the gloom, their minds forever shattered by the psychic shockwave of a soulless horror they could never hope to comprehend. They are left to rot in the dark, meaningless phantoms trapped in a permanent purgatory of their own ruined sanity. At the dead heart of this labyrinth sits the catalyst of their damnation, the withered, hollow corpse of a charismatic tyrant who dared to harness the infernal power of the warp. His vast empires, his fanatical legions, and his blasphemous ambitions have been reduced to ash and agonizing memories. This is the merciless truth of our galaxy, a dreadful reality the Inquisition guards with jealous fanaticism. In this brutal universe, mortals strive to make their mark by shouting their defiance into the heavens. They summon terrifying arcane energies, they build monumental armies, and they ignite the stars with the blinding fire of their vibrant pride. They believe that absolute supremacy is found in the roaring, chaotic tempest of the Imperium, yet the ultimate authority in this cold cosmos belongs to the blank, uncaring emptiness. No matter how deafening the rebellion, no matter how blinding the psychic light of false divinity, it can always be violently snuffed out. It requires only a single, concentrated drop of true nothingness to extinguish the fiercest flame of existence. The warp may scream with the voices of 1,000,000,000,000 burning souls, but the absolute silence of the void will always be waiting to consume them all.